During the solemn silence of a funeral, a young boy's scream pierced the air. "Get her out, now!" The mourners, gathered to bid farewell to a beloved mother, froze in shock. 4-year-old Leo, with tears streaming down his face, pointed frantically towards his mother's casket, his plea echoing through the chapel. As the priest approached to console him, Leo's words sent a shiver down his spine, compelling him to call 911. At the funeral, nearly every available chair was occupied. Mourners were gathered to pay their final respects to Leo's mother. Several people had spoken loving words, and by now they were getting ready to place some flowers at the casket. The solemn silence was interrupted by a young boy's scream. "Get her out now!" echoed through the chapel as Leo pointed frantically towards his mother's casket. Leo's father, Thomas, quickly scooped him up, trying to soothe him, but the boy's cries only grew louder. "Mommy needs to get out!" he insisted, squirming in his father's arms. The mourners exchanged uneasy glances, the air thick with confusion and sorrow. There wasn't a sound, but Leo wails as he tried to break free from his father's arms. The priest approached, his expression one of concern, etched with disbelief. "Leo, what do you mean? Why would you say that?" he asked gently as he placed a hand on the young boy's shoulder. Leo's response was choked with sobs as he replied, "She told me. Mommy told me last night in my dream." Whispers rustled through the chapel as the priest signaled discreetly to one of the ushers. Within minutes, the hushed tones of a 911 call could be heard over the soft organ music in the background. Something was not right, and everyone gathered could feel it. People exchanged nervous glances, trying to overhear what was happening. Outside, the gray sky loomed over the chapel. Thomas walked with Leo around the church garden, trying to distract him from the situation, but Leo's eyes remained fixed on the chapel doors. "She's not happy there, Daddy," he murmured, tugging on his father's hand as if trying to steer the man back towards the casket. Back inside, the police and paramedics arrived, moving with quiet efficiency towards the casket. The officers tried to urge the crowd into the hallway, but most visitors refused to leave. The presence of the emergency responders, while meant to be reassuring, only heightened the sense of unease. The congregation watched, breath held, as the casket was carefully opened. A gasp escaped from the crowd. Leo's mother, Maria, lay peaceful and serene, but something was amiss nonetheless. A folded piece of paper was visible in her clasped hands, something no one had expected. The priest noticed it too, his eyes widening slightly. The paramedics turned to the police officers in question, confusion written on their faces. Thomas and Leo returned just in time to watch the paramedics gently pull the note out of Maria's clasped hands. Thomas's heart raced as he exchanged a look with the priest. Where did that note come from, and what secrets did the paper hold? Leo tugged at his father's sleeve, looking up at him with wide, fearful eyes. While they unfolded the note, the room filled with the scent of Maria's favorite perfume, almost as if she were present. The paramedics handed the note to Thomas to read, who hesitated, his hands trembling. The priest urged him softly, aware of the emotional turmoil that was sure to course through the man. "For Maria's sake, Thomas." Thomas read the note in silence, his face draining of color. He looked around, the eyes of his family and friends fixed on him, filled with a mix of stark curiosity and dread. Most importantly, he saw Leo looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. He folded the note back, placing it in his pocket. "We need to talk," he murmured to the priest, guiding him aside. Thomas guided the priest into a quiet hallway, his hands shaking. The murmurs from the chapel faded as they moved away. Thomas's eyes darted around, ensuring no one followed. "Father, we need to talk now," he whispered, urgency dripping from his voice. The priest nodded, sensing the gravity of the situation. They stopped near a stained glass window, the sunlight casting colorful patterns on their faces. Thomas took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and reached into his pocket for the note. With trembling hands, Thomas pulled out the crumpled note he had taken from Maria's hand. He handed it to the priest, his eyes filled with worry. The priest unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. As he read, his face grew increasingly pale, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He looked up at Thomas, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "This is serious," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest read the note again, his face losing its color. The words, "It wasn't an accident," stared back at him, sending chills down his spine. He looked at Thomas, his eyes wide with shock. "Are you sure this was in her hand?" he asked, his voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his own fear mirrored in the priest's eyes. They both stood there in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The priest took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We need to think carefully about what to do next." In hushed tones, Thomas and the priest debated their next steps. "We can't ignore this," Thomas insisted, his voice low but urgent. The priest nodded, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. "But we need to be cautious," he replied, his brow furrowed in thought. They both knew the note's implications were serious. "Should we tell the authorities?" Thomas asked. The priest hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but discreetly. We don't want to cause a panic." They both agreed, their faces set with determination. Deciding to involve the authorities, Thomas and the priest moved swiftly. The priest stepped back into the chapel, catching the eye of a nearby police officer. With a subtle gesture, he signaled for the officer to join them in the hallway. The officer, sensing the urgency, followed without question. "We need your help," Thomas whispered urgently. The officer nodded, his expression serious. Thomas and the priest explained the situation, showing him the note. The officer's face hardened as he read, understanding the gravity of their request. Thomas hurried back to the main room, scanning for his mother. She stood near the entrance, worry etched on her face. "Mom, can you take Leo for a bit? Keep him away from here," he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded, taking Leo's hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly, leading him outside. Thomas watched them go, relief mixing with anxiety. Leo looked back, his eyes wide with confusion, but trusting his father's decision. Thomas and the priest, their faces grim, made their way to the officers near the chapel entrance. "We need to talk to you," the priest said quietly, urgency in his voice. The officers exchanged glances, but followed without hesitation. They moved to the secluded hallway, away from prying eyes. "This can't wait," Thomas added, his tone firm. The officers nodded, understanding the seriousness in their expressions. They gathered in the narrow space, ready to hear what Thomas and the priest had to say. Thomas took a deep breath, thinking of Leo. "He doesn't need to know everything," he muttered to the priest. The priest nodded in agreement. "Family trust is crucial right now," he said softly. Thomas looked back towards where his mother had taken Leo. "I'll make sure he's safe, and he'll stay with her," he assured the priest. It was a small comfort, knowing Leo was away from the growing tension. They had to protect him, no matter what. In the narrow hallway, Thomas and the priest whispered urgently. "We have to show them the note," Thomas insisted. The priest nodded, glancing around. "But we need to do it carefully. We can't cause a scene," he replied. They planned their approach, deciding who would speak first. "We have to make them understand the importance," the priest added. Thomas agreed, his mind racing. They had to be clear and precise, ensuring the officers grasped the gravity of the note's message. Thomas and the priest stood together, their faces set in grim determination. The hallway seemed to close in around them as they awaited the officers. Thomas clutched the note in his hand, feeling its weight. The priest placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. The sound of footsteps approached, and Thomas took a deep breath. They were ready to unravel the mystery, determined to find the truth about Maria's death. Police and detectives quickly filled the hallway, their expressions serious. Thomas and the priest stepped back, making room for the officers. The lead detective, John Parker, pushed through the crowd, his eyes scanning the scene. "What's going on?" Parker asked, his voice commanding attention. Thomas swallowed hard, holding out the note. The urgency in the air was palpable, everyone sensing the severity of the situation. The detectives gathered closer, ready to hear what Thomas and the priest had to reveal. Thomas handed the note to Detective Parker, his hands shaking slightly. Parker took it, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "It wasn't an accident," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. He read it again, then looked up at Thomas and the priest. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his tone demanding but calm. Thomas explained quickly, pointing to the casket. Parker nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. The weight of the note's implications settled heavily on the group. Detective Parker didn't waste a moment. "All right, listen up," he barked, turning to his team. "We need to question everyone here. No one leaves until we get statements." Officers moved quickly, setting up makeshift stations around the chapel. "Start with the family and close friends." Thomas watched as the police sprang into action, their efficiency reassuring him slightly. The investigation had begun, and there was no turning back. Detective Parker turned back to Thomas. "I'm Detective John Parker," he said, extending his hand. Thomas shook it, grateful for the firm grip. "Thomas," he replied. Parker's professional demeanor was calming amidst the chaos. "We need to figure out who had access to your wife," Parker said. Thomas nodded, his mind racing with names and faces. "Do you have any suspects?" Parker asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet, but we'll help however we can." The detective's confidence gave Thomas a glimmer of hope. Thomas and Detective Parker exchanged a firm handshake, sealing their cooperation. "We need a guest list," Parker said. Thomas nodded, pulling out his phone. "I have it here," he said, scrolling quickly. He handed the phone to Parker, who started noting down names. "We'll start with this," Parker said. Thomas watched as the detectives' team moved efficiently, questioning attendees and taking notes. The investigation was in full swing, and Thomas felt a surge of determination. They would find the truth about Maria's death. Documents rustled as Thomas and the priest sifted through the church office. "We need everything related to Maria," Thomas said, his voice tense. The priest nodded, pulling out files and records. "Here, these might help," he said, handing a stack to Thomas. The papers detailed various aspects of Maria's life, from her baptism to her marriage. Thomas glanced through them quickly, knowing every piece of information was crucial. They gathered the documents and headed back to the chapel, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on them. Returning to the chapel, Thomas and the priest noticed a palpable change. The once somber atmosphere was now charged with tension. Groups of mourners huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Police officers patrolled the area, their presence adding to the unease. Thomas could see the fear and confusion on people's faces. They walked through the transformed space, their steps purposeful as they prepared to aid the investigation further. Officers moved through the crowd, pulling individuals aside for questioning. Each attendee's face displayed a mix of emotions, from confusion to outright fear. "Please, just answer the questions truthfully," an officer said to a trembling woman. Thomas watched as people he knew were probed for inconsistencies. It was unsettling, seeing friends and family under such scrutiny. He hoped the truth would come to light without causing too much pain. The questions continued, each answer bringing them one step closer to understanding what had happened. The air grew heavier with each passing minute. Every statement was dissected, every alibi checked against Thomas's guest list. Officers moved swiftly, their eyes sharp for any sign of deceit. "Where were you at the time?" one asked, pen poised over his notebook. Thomas stood nearby, providing context and clarifications when needed. He felt the tension in the room rise as the investigation dug deeper. The seriousness of the situation weighed heavily on everyone, and the truth seemed both elusive and imminent. Amid the procedural chaos, Thomas remained a crucial part of the investigation. He watched the officers work, his heart heavy with the unfolding truths. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered to himself. The officers' voices mixed with the murmurs of the attendees, creating a low hum of activity. Thomas felt torn between his need for answers and the pain each new discovery brought. He stood by, ready to help, his mind racing with questions and concerns about what they would uncover next. In the chapel's shadowed corner, Thomas found his family. His mother's whispered words were a tentative comfort. "We're here for you," she said, her hand gently squeezing his. Thomas nodded, grateful for their presence. The soft hum of their voices was a balm amidst the chaos. He took a deep breath, trying to draw strength from the familiar faces around him. The weight of the day pressed down, but here, in this small corner, he felt a glimmer of peace. Leo's small arms wrapped a row on Thomas's leg, his innocent voice filled with confusion and sadness. "Daddy, what's happening?" he asked, looking up with wide eyes. Thomas bent down, brushing a hand through Leo's hair. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly, trying to reassure him. The questions in Leo's eyes mirrored the turmoil in Thomas's heart. He hugged his son tightly, wishing he could shield him from the harsh realities unfolding around them. Thomas lifted Leo into his arms, holding him close. "I promise, we'll get through this," he whispered, his resolve hardening. Leo rested his head on Thomas's shoulder, the weight of his small body a comforting presence. "You're safe with me," Thomas continued, his voice firm despite the uncertainty. He felt a surge of determination, knowing he had to be strong for his son. The love for Leo gave him the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Thomas's assurances seemed to calm Leo, but the child's eyes remained haunted. They reflected the confusion and fear of the day. "Why is everyone so sad?" Leo asked, his voice small. Thomas's heart ached at the question. "Sometimes things are hard to understand," he replied gently. "But we're going to be okay." Leo nodded, but the shadows in his eyes didn't disappear. Thomas hugged him tighter, wishing he could take away his son's pain. Their quiet moments stood in stark contrast to the investigative storm raging through the chapel. Commands echoed off the walls as officers moved with purpose. Thomas watched them from his corner, the chaos feeling worlds apart from his small bubble of calm. He held Leo close, cherishing the brief respite. The scene around them was a whirlwind, but here, in this tiny haven, Thomas found a fleeting sense of peace. He knew it wouldn't last, but for now, it was enough. A moment of familial warmth enveloped Thomas as his mother embraced him. Her touch was light, but laden with unspoken fears. "We'll get through this," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of comfort and worry. The familiar scent of her perfume brought back memories, grounding him in the present. He took a deep breath, grateful for her support. The chapel's chaos seemed distant for a moment, replaced by the simple, reassuring presence of his family. The chapel slowly emptied, the interrogations concluding. Weary attendees drifted away, their spirits burdened by the day's revelations. Thomas watched them go, feeling the weight of their shared sorrow. He exchanged tired nods with a few close friends, their faces etched with concern. The once bustling room grew quiet, the silence almost eerie. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to process everything that had happened. The day had been long and exhausting, But it wasn't over yet. Detective Parker approached, his expression grim. "We've completed the interviews," he reported, his tone serious. "There are some discrepancies in attendance that we need to address." Thomas's heart sank at the words. "What kind of discrepancies?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Parker shook his head. "Some people who should have been here weren't, and a few others gave conflicting statements." Thomas nodded, feeling a knot of worry tighten in his chest. The investigation was far from over. Concern etched deeper into Thomas's features as he absorbed the detective's update. The list of attendees now seemed suspect. He glanced at the names, his mind racing. Who would do this? He wondered aloud, his voice tinged with desperation. The priest stood by, offering silent support. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had to stay strong, for Leo and for Maria. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it might be. The detective's departing steps echoed in the now quiet chapel. Thomas stood there, alone with his thoughts. He stared at the casket, his mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. The implications of the missing guests gnawed at him. What are we missing? He thought, frustration bubbling up. The silence of the chapel was deafening, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Thomas knew he had to keep pushing forward, but at that moment, he felt utterly lost. Thomas's drive home was somber, the car filled with silent tension. His mother sat beside him, staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. In the back seat, Leo's small figure was still, his eyes reflecting the confusion and sadness of the day. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on all of them. The silence in the car was almost unbearable, each of them wrapped in their own worries and fears. Thomas cleared his throat, trying to break the heavy silence. "Hey, buddy, how about we watch your favorite movie tonight?" he suggested, glancing at Leo through the rearview mirror. Leo's gaze remained distant, his small face thoughtful. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Thomas's heart ached at the sight. He looked at his mother, who gave him a weak smile. "We'll get through this," she whispered. But the shadows of the day lingered, refusing to be dispelled by simple words. Once home, they fell into familiar routines. Thomas's mother took over Leo's evening care, her actions gentle yet mechanically efficient. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you ready for bed," she said softly, guiding Leo to his room. Thomas watched them go, feeling a pang of gratitude mixed with sorrow. He appreciated her help more than ever. As the house quieted down, he knew he had to keep moving forward, even as exhaustion tugged at him. He had work to do. Thomas secluded himself in his study, the detective's lists spread out before him. His focus was intense as he cross-referenced names against memories and faces from the funeral. He scribbled notes, his mind working overtime. "Who didn't show up?" he muttered, scanning the lists. Every name represented a piece of the puzzle he needed to solve. The task was daunting, but he couldn't afford to miss anything. He was determined to find the truth, no matter how long it took. The night deepened around Thomas, the room illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. Each name on the list felt like a heavy weight on his heart. He rubbed his eyes, fatigue setting in, but he pressed on. The quiet of the house contrasted with the turmoil inside him. He flipped through the lists, his mind replaying the events of the day. The questions and doubts gnawed at him, but he refused to give up. He had to find the missing pieces. Hours ticked by until Thomas, with a mix of relief and dread, identified 3 unaccounted-for guests. These people were supposed to have attended the funeral but were notably absent. He reviewed the list again, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Why weren't they there? He wondered aloud. The names stared back at him, each one a potential clue. His mind raced with possibilities, but he knew he couldn't jump to conclusions. He had to report his findings immediately. Thomas hastily contacted Detective Parker, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "Detective, I've found 3 people who should have been at the funeral but weren't," he reported. Parker's response was swift. "Give me the names," he said, his tone all business. Thomas relayed the information, his heart pounding. He knew these leads could be crucial. "Thank you, Thomas. We'll look into it right away," Parker assured him. The call ended, leaving Thomas feeling both anxious and hopeful. Together they quickly eliminated one name, a childhood friend of Maria's, absolved by her coincidental childbirth. "She gave birth yesterday," Parker confirmed. Thomas sighed, a mix of relief and frustration. 1 name down, 2 to go. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus. "Okay, let's move on to the others," he said, his voice strained. The investigation had to continue, and there was no time to dwell on the cleared suspect. They needed to find the truth. Thomas's relief was short-lived as the focus narrowed to the remaining 2 suspects. Their potential motives gnawed at his mind. What if one of them is involved? He thought, the possibility chilling him. Parker's team started digging into the backgrounds of the remaining names. Thomas felt a growing sense of urgency. He couldn't rest until they had answers. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth. The night waned, leaving Thomas exhausted, yet wired. The puzzle pieces slowly formed a clearer, darker picture. He sat in the dim light, his mind racing. Every detail mattered, and he couldn't afford to overlook anything. "We're getting closer," he whispered to himself, trying to stay focused. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. The investigation was far from over, but for the first time, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. They would find the answers. Detective Parker's early morning call injected a new urgency into the investigation. "Thomas, we have some developments," Parker began, his voice filled with resolve. Thomas rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. "What's going on?" he asked, his heart racing. Parker's tone was grim. "We need to discuss the autopsy and a few other leads," he said. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air, signaling that things were about to get even more intense. They discussed the forthcoming autopsies and the necessity of unraveling Maria's cause of death. Parker's tone was grim yet determined. "The autopsy will give us answers we desperately need," Parker said. Thomas listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities. "We have to know what really happened," he replied, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. Parker agreed, emphasizing the importance of the next steps. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Thomas. I promise," he said firmly. Thomas hung up, the room suddenly silent around him. The weight of the conversation settled in, making it hard to breathe. His mind reeled with the implications of their discussion. The silence was deafening, each second stretching out painfully. He glanced around the room, seeing the shadows cast by the early morning light. Every detail seemed sharper, more poignant. Thomas knew they were on the brink of uncovering something significant, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Alone, Thomas allowed himself a moment to grieve. His emotions, raw and near the surface, surged up. He buried his face in his hands, letting the tears flow freely. The pain of losing Maria hit him with full force, and he surrendered to his sorrow. The house, usually filled with the sounds of family life, felt achingly empty. Thomas's sobs echoed through the silent rooms, a testament to his heartbreak. This brief surrender to his emotions was cathartic, a necessary release. Steadying himself, Thomas turned his focus to the day ahead. He wiped away his tears, taking a deep breath. The possibility that Maria's death was indeed sinister weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had to remain strong. "I need to be ready for whatever comes next," he thought, his resolve hardening. He prepared mentally, reviewing the information they had so far. The day would bring new challenges, and Thomas was determined to face them head-on, seeking justice for Maria. Dawn's early knock startled Thomas awake. He rubbed his eyes, disoriented. His mother's note lay on the kitchen table, explaining her departure with Leo. "We're staying with Aunt Carol for a while," she had written, seeking refuge from the storm of recent events. Thomas felt a pang of loneliness, but understood their need for safety. He folded the note carefully, appreciating her decision. The house felt emptier without them, but he knew it was for the best. Opening the door revealed Detective Parker, his expression solemn. A foreboding tension emanated from his stance. "Morning, Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken words. Thomas stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in, Detective," he replied, his heart sinking. Parker's presence this early could only mean more troubling news. As the detective crossed the threshold, Thomas braced himself for what was to come, feeling the weight of the day already pressing down on him. Inviting the detective in, Thomas headed to the kitchen. "I'll make some coffee," he said, needing the brief respite of the mundane task. He busied himself with the familiar routine, the sound of the percolator oddly comforting. Parker sat at the table, his eyes following Thomas's movements. "Thanks," the detective murmured. Thomas poured the steaming coffee into 2 mugs, his hands steady despite the growing anxiety. They both knew the conversation ahead would be grim. Seated across from each other, their conversation was heavy. Parker's words confirmed their worst fears. Foul play was involved in Maria's death. "We found evidence of hidden violence," Parker said, his tone grave. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "Are you sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The detective nodded, his expression somber. The confirmation of foul play was a devastating blow. Thomas felt a mix of anger, fear, and determination. The detective's details were sparse but chilling. Maria's death was marked by hidden violence, casting a sinister shadow over their lives. "There were signs of struggle," Parker explained, his voice steady. Thomas clenched his fists, his mind racing. Who could have done this? He wondered aloud. Parker shook his head. "We're still investigating, but we have some leads." The room felt colder, the enormity of the situation sinking in. They had to find the truth, no matter the cost. Weeks passed with exhaustive police work. Finally, one more name was cleared. A friend's forgotten engagement provided an unbreakable alibi. "She was out of town," Parker explained during a late-night call. Thomas felt a mix of relief and frustration. Each cleared name brought them closer to the truth, but the list was shrinking. "Thank you for letting me know," Thomas said, his voice tired. The investigation pressed on, and the relentless pursuit of answers continued. The narrowing suspect list brought relentless focus. The investigation's endgame loomed as one name remained ominously unchecked. Thomas reviewed the names again, his mind racing. It has to be someone close, he thought, the realization settling in. The police were meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. The tension grew as they inched closer to the truth. Thomas knew they were on the brink of a breakthrough, but the anticipation was almost unbearable. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach. Detective Parker's return visit brought a mix of dread and anticipation. He invited Thomas for a walk, hinting at a serious talk. "We need to discuss something important," Parker said, his tone grave. Thomas nodded, grabbing his jacket. As they stepped outside, the cool air did little to calm his nerves. The detective's demeanor was somber, and Thomas braced himself for what was to come. They walked in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy in the air. As they walked, the detective revealed the bitter truth. "It was Maria's estranged brother," Parker said quietly. Thomas stopped in his tracks, shock washing over him. "What? Why?" he asked, struggling to comprehend. "Driven by envy and spite," Parker explained. The revelation hit hard, shattering any remaining illusions of familial safety. Thomas felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had always hoped for reconciliation, but this was too much. The bitter truth left him reeling, his mind struggling to process the enormity of the betrayal. The revelation shattered the last illusions of familial safety. The betrayal was too profound, leaving Thomas to grasp the full extent of their tragedy. He felt a crushing weight on his chest, the world around him seeming to blur. "I trusted him," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with pain. Parker placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make sure justice is served," he promised. Thomas nodded, but the sense of loss was overwhelming. The truth had come to light, but the cost was immeasurable.